From the first sparks of love to the first saying of I do. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jason Burns.
And I'm Danny Nucci. And this is the What About Podcast.
This is the What About Podcast. And I have to say, Danny, in this podcast, you talk a little bit about a list of things that you have, I guess your wife has deemed annoying, but you didn't go over that list. Can you give us some of them?
Hell no.
Is that for you? That's for you?
Hell no. Apparently, I make strange noises that I was not aware that I make.
Awake or asleep?
Yes.
Both?
Yes. Apparently, I do a lot of things that I was not aware of. No, it's just kind of a joke with us. Like, you know, when we talk about the things, I'll put it on the list. There's also just a bunch of things that, you know, like for instance, like. Okay, I'll give you a stupid for instance. So we have I do the dishes, and so there's this spray feature. You know, there's like the regular sink and then the spray feature, and I always leave it on the spray feature.
Oh,
and so when she goes to turn it on, it splashes in her glasses. And this is like among, 1,000 things that I have to remember. Okay, so when you lock the door.
Now, is that something you do on purpose?
No, I rinse.
Yeah,
I rinse and I forget. But, part of being in a relationship is starting to be conscious about what other people's needs are. And I'm only conscious about me, as you know. It's just all me all the time. So this is a tremendous amount of work.
Now, are you allowed to have a list for your wife? Like, do you have?
No, I'm sorry. Look, I know there's a multitude of different kinds of partnerships, but when it comes to my partnership, man and woman in this particular version, it's a double standard. Mm-hmm. What is good for the goose is not good for the gander, and that's just the way it is.
You don't see a lot of ganders these days.
You don't see a lot of ganders, but I envy people where that's not the case, where there is kind of like, okay, the same rules apply. Not my house.
The list of the most annoying things that I do, and I think my wife would agree with this, and we may have talked about it previously, is that I like to get a nice pantsing in every morning, preferably in front of the sliding glass door where the neighbors are. So
that's amazing.
And as you know, my wife is, as you said, a saint, and
she really is. I mean, I don't know how she does it.
Imagine getting pantsed every day, and you really get extra points if she's like making a peanut butter jelly
I will say that
kids.
She's still charmed by you.
She's
still charmed.
Very charming.
She is. I could see that she's still charmed by you when I spend time with you guys.
You know who's charming? Amy Morin.
Amy Morin is very charming. I love talking to her. I kind of felt like I said it, but I feel like I got free therapy. Like I just wanted to pick her brain and go, well, what about this? And how do you deal with this? Yeah, it was just great talking to Amy Morin, author of 13 Things Mentally Strong Couples Don't Do. That's her new book. She's got a series on 13 things and mental strength. Was a treat to talk to her. She's very entertaining.
And she's on a boat.
On a boat, Amy Morin. First of all, before we begin, I need to know about the sailboat.
And if you're at sea, are you docked or at sea?
The life on the sailboat, how that works for you, how you're able to get it. I need the whole thing.
So we're not bobbing around in the ocean. It's not quite as exciting as it sounds. So I have a documinium in the Florida Keys. So I'm tied to a dock, and there's like a tiki hut. So I own some land too. So I'm usually at the dock so I can have high speed internet and do the podcast and things like that. But essentially it's just kind of like a floating apartment most of the time, except a small one.
And probably something that you have to consider a bug out bag if there's a hurricane coming in or something like that?
That'd be correct. I've been on the boat in a tropical storm, and that was enough. If there's a Category 3 hurricane coming this way, I'll be the first in line to evacuate.
Well, first, if you can start for our listeners explaining what a psychotherapist is and how you help people in your practice, just because, I'm from the publishing world, and spaces and punctuation mean everything. And if you put a space between psycho and therapist, you got a much different book than if I was writing. So if you could break it down for our listeners, that would be fantastic.
That's correct. So a psychotherapist just means that I have a master's degree in clinical social work. So I can see people in my therapy office in a private practice. There's a bunch of different licenses. So in different places, somebody might be a licensed mental health counselor. They might be a licensed professional counselor. Different states have a slightly different twist on various initials you'll see after somebody's name. But basically, it just means that I'm licensed to diagnose and treat mental health conditions, anything from depression to anxiety, people come into an office and talk to me for one-on-one therapy.
How does that affect the Zoom? Because can you treat someone in a different state?
Good
That
question.
is a good question. So pre-COVID, the rules were really strict that I'm licensed in the state of Florida, so I could only see people in Florida. They loosened the rules during COVID because we had such a shortage, and now
Sure.
there's like a gray.
And the need for mental health professionals has skyrocketed.
That's the thing.
And a lot of people who probably travel to and from Florida a lot.
Well, right. So then it gets weird, especially now that so many people are like traveling. There's a lot of people that live in a van, and you're like, well, if they travel to different states all the time, how does that work? So lots of questions about it. And there's a lot more gray areas about where and how you can treat people in state lines and those sorts of things. But you can also become a coach. So I do more of what I call mental strength coaching, and I don't have to abide by the psychotherapy guidelines in the same way.
So let me ask you this, because I'm fascinated. How did you get into it? When did the decision come for you? When did you go, you know what? I think this is what I'm going to study. You know what? I'm going this direction. You know what? I'm going to keep studying. How about this? I'm getting certifications. How about this? This is going to be my life.
So
on a boat.
Right, yeah.
No, the boat we already know about. The boat is just one of those things.
But we're from TV and film, Amy. So I'm thinking, psychotherapist on a boat, that has a nice ring to it for a TV show.
Oh, that would be a fun TV show, wouldn't it?
That's where we've landed. It's not how we got there, which is what I'm interested in.
So I was going to be a doctor, like a pre-med. I was a pre-med major. My first day of school, we had to dissect cats.
Whoa.
And like everybody was really excited about dissecting a cat except for me. And then I realized I actually don't want to be a doctor. I just like the idea of being a doctor. So I called my older sister. She had just graduated with a bachelor's in psychology. And I said, quick, I need a new major by like today, because I'm not dissecting a cat tomorrow. What do you think about psychology? And she said, don't do it. Because if you have a bachelor's in psychology, she said it's too general. So she said, at least go for social work, and you can have a social work license when you graduate. So I switched my major, like assuming I would, in the next 4 years, find something I was really invested in, but ended up sticking with it. I love social work once I started doing it. So then I got my bachelor's, and it was no question. I just wanted to go on and get my master's, got my master's, and then spent most of my early career. I was a therapist in rural Maine, who coincidentally, that same sister went on to get her
in rural Maine.
And my sister got her master's in clinical social work, and we had adjoining offices in the middle of nowhere, Maine, kind of like Niles and Fraser Crane.
This is another show right here.
What? Sisters in rural Maine.
So I'm in Massachusetts.
Yeah, he's a
how
New
rural?
Englander.
How rural are we talking?
So we're talking
way up there?
an hour north of Bangor. Population,
wow. Okay.
in the 5,000 range.
Which you wouldn't think it's possible to have a practice because of the skepticism.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because there was always a wait list, a really long wait list. My sister still works there to this day. She has a 6-month waiting list to get in.
How is that? I just don't understand how there's that many people that need help.
There are. And so, we were in the bigger town out of a long...
I don't need any help. So I'm surprised when people do go on.
But then one of the problems in a really small town is you might see the teacher, but you also see their student. And so people are concerned about who they're going to run into in the waiting room.
Of course.
Or if you park your car out front and you have a recognizable car, everybody knows you're the person that drives the orange Jeep. So it was interesting for sure.
And nonetheless, they're like, yeah, I don't care. I need some help.
Right.
Help me. Help me work this out. I'm struggling. That's amazing. So you were doing that for a while. And that's where you started to build sort of your practice and your chops in terms of being able to listen to people and not feel like you wanted to just bang your head against the wall at the end of the night.
Correct. So
it's a lot of feelings to hold, lady.
It really is. I mean?
It's a lot of feelings to hold.
Right. To see 8 people a day who are just coming in, and a lot of people have incredibly deep stories and struggles, and you would never know it.
Trauma.
Right. And you wouldn't know it by looking at them, but then you're like, wow. And yet these people are still going back out into the world.
And if you're doing your work, then it's really heightened, and you're really dealing with a lot of emotions coming up. And then you're supposed to go, heat the water for your pasta at night. It's not an easy thing. People don't realize that.
Yeah, you're right. And it is a weird thing.
And it's a muscle, right? You have to learn how to be. I mean, we're getting right into the mental toughness here, but it really is a muscle that you have to learn how to, manage the letting it go
Yep.
and also being invested. Can you talk a
Well,
little
and
bit about that?
I just want to jump in there too, because we tend to take
No,
it for
no,
granted.
my
The
questions only.
the people on the outside, right? Like for like a massage therapist, we think, oh, we're going in, we're going to feel better, but that poor person's on their feet for 8 hours a day. Their hands are all, but we just take it for granted. So, like Danny was saying, how do you take care of you?
Yeah, it was so important to always just make sure that we were on top of that, recognizing that, all right, I'm starting to get burned out, or I'm lacking a little empathy today, or I'm really struggling here. And then when you have problems in your personal life, it just starts to get even more difficult because you're like, all right, I'm sitting here listening to this person, but I'm kind of distracted by somebody's illness in my family, or I'm really struggling with some problems on my own, and yet I have to be really present with this person. So it's certainly a work in progress. Most of us have to work really hard at trying to manage all of that.
And once you were like, okay, I can do this. All right, I'm figuring out a balance, right? And then you also had to have your own. I'm assuming you also had to have your own therapist.
Yeah, most therapists, you
You have to,
always,
right? Isn't it part of it as you're building your?
yeah, you have to see like a clinical supervisor, and a lot of that is about talking about what comes up for you. So maybe one of your patients reminds you of a relative that you didn't like, and so therefore you're struggling to be present with them, or you have struggled with the same issue, and yet somebody
Why do
else,
I hate them? Why
right?
is it that I hate that they come in? It's the one person I just want to get the fuck out of the office when
Yeah.
they start to. Oh, I see.
And so, did this lead to your journey of becoming an accidental author and writing that letter to yourself that ultimately went viral? And if so, I mean, can you just fill our listeners into what that experience was and how you got to where you are now with 6 books behind you?
Yeah, so I was glad I was a therapist because my 20s, that decade, was awful. So my mom died, my husband died, my father-in-law died, a former foster child died. It was like the list went on and on about grief. And I can't even explain to you what it was like. I was 26-year-old widow. I didn't have my mom at the time in my life when my friends are getting married and talking about kids.
Were you
I'm in
still in
this
Maine at this time,
I
Amy?
was. And so I'm living in Maine, and if to add insult to injury, my husband was a primary breadwinner. Therapists also don't earn a ton of money. And I needed to figure out, what do I do? How do I not become homeless in this situation as well? So I started writing freelance articles as a way to keep the lights on. You can only work so many hours a week as a therapist, but I could write in the evenings and on the weekends. And if I wanted to write, I could. But if I was in a bad spot, I didn't have to. So I found that to be the best way to earn enough money that I didn't have to sell my house and I didn't have to move.
Did it help?
And
Did it
then,
help? Because I mean, obviously, you're dealing with waves of grief as you're trying to figure out how to keep your head above water, right? So I guess I'm curious. Did the fact that you were focusing on writing these things that would, help pay the bills, was that helpful to dive into that?
it was helpful because I was taking action. So early on, I wrote articles for like these other content mills is what they were called back in the day, where I might write an article about 10 fun things to do in New York City. I didn't write about anything therapy related, but I was like, all right, I'm taking action in my spare time because I have this problem. There was a lot of problems in my life I couldn't solve, but here was one I could work on this. So if I write these articles and I churn them out fast enough, I can at least keep the lights on.
And when did you know you had it? When did you know you could do it? I mean, because obviously you're like, I'm going to write, and then all of a sudden you're actually getting responses that like, yeah, could you write some more? And by the way, there's this other situation. Could you write for them?
Yeah, and that's exactly how it happened. Is like the opportunity started to find me, and I remember the first month I earned $600 from freelance writing, and I thought, okay, if I had earned $600, that was enough at that moment in my life that I could keep the door to my house, closed, and I could make sure that I had heat and water. And so I thought, all right,
Which is very
this is
important
it.
in Maine. Heat is very important.
Oh man, you need heat
It
in
is
Maine.
very important. And it was cold. So, and then it was really the first article I ever wrote that was heartfelt happened to be this article called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And I didn't write it as a way to publish it online. It was a letter to myself because I was at a dark place. That was at the moment when my father-in-law was given a terminal prognosis. And I just thought, I knew I was going to lose him. So I write this letter to myself, and I found it helpful. So I thought, why not publish it online? Maybe it will help somebody else. Put it on the internet, and 50 million people read it. One of them happened to be a literary agent who said, you should write a book. And at first I was like, I don't really know, because there was no backstory to the article. So everybody, like from Forbes to Fox News, is calling me and they're like, you're a therapist, you mastered these things. And the truth was, no, I struggled with all of these things. So I wasn't sure wanted to write it.
Did you feel like sort of imposter syndrome having written
Uh-huh.
that? Oh, wow.
Absolutely.
But my question is, because obviously all your books have this thematic of don't do, right? Why do you think now looking back, right? Obviously you've had a chance to explore this. Why do you think you went with don't do?
Because when I was struggling the most, the last thing I wanted was a long list of things I had to do today. But if I woke up and said, "Amy, just don't do these things and you'll be okay," I could do that. That felt like something I could manage at that moment in my life.
So you started out in your career as a therapist helping people, and then you found yourself helping people probably all over the world that you never envisioned would be the case. Is that sort of sum it up?
That's it exactly. I was, I was content in rural Maine with a handful of, patients that I was seeing up there. And now my books are in 40 something languages and I get emails from people all over the planet who say thank you. And that's just unfathomable to this day.
I'm curious if, you hear all these stories of, people trolling people online. I'm an agent. I can get you into the movies, kid. Did you have to question when that literary agent wrote you and said, this can't be real? This isn't it.
I did. So at that moment in time, my article had been picked up by Forbes and it went on to get about 10 million views on Forbes in a short period of time. So
Why do you think? Why do you think? I mean, obviously now you have a chance to look back at it, and obviously it's turned into themes and books that are successful and do well and are helping people. But what do you think? What do you think? Why did it grab the zeitgeist at that point?
I think it was the don't do. I think people were intrigued because it was framed like that. I think the number 13 helped.
Yeah, why 13? Did that just happen to be what you landed with?
Correct. And then I think just
It's
because
amazing how these things happen.
people
right?
didn't know what mental strength was.
And now it's your thing, right?
Yeah.
It's so
But
funny.
it's also because you were going through these things and having difficulty yourself, the honesty as a writer, as a human, came out in that writing as well, which probably helped people connect to it.
Right. I think so. I think because it was a raw piece of material that I put out there and I didn't really, I mean, if I had thought 50 million people were going to read the article, I would have censored it a lot more.
Edited it a little bit, sure.
Right. It would have double checked
some
and
adjustments.
Right. And so I remember when it went viral, like at first I thought I had ruined my therapy career because I thought I just put this out there in the world. I'm not sure this is a good thing. And then, as you say, I had emails from people that were making all of these offers, including a literary agent. And I didn't even know what a literary agent was, so I didn't respond to her. And everybody's offering me lots of opportunities and things, and I didn't know what to do. I had no idea.
And suddenly, did you become a talking head on the networks? Like CNN wanted you on, and this
Yeah,
kind of stuff
so
too?
like MTV in Finland and CNN in Mexico and Forbes, everybody's calling me and asking me to be on their show.
Which is everybody's dream, to be on MTV in Finland,
right?
Huge desire for people. Well, I think, I mean, in a sense, by the time you wrote it, it was still experiential, right? You're still basically trying to apply these principles in your own life. And so I'm assuming that's what really resonated, is that it was your own experience was going into this, and you were essentially you were the guinea pig.
Yeah, that's just it. I had the fortunate experience as a therapist. It was like I had a revolving door of case studies, people that came into my office all these years. And I would be like, well, what helps some people get through these tough times and what holds people back? And so I was learning from them and hopefully teaching them at the same time, but really just studying people and figuring out, all right, well, what are the bad habits that are most likely to hold us back in life?
I wonder if another part of it too, Amy, is that, again, from the outside perspective, those who aren't therapists, we assume all therapists have their stuff together. They got it together. And the fact that you allowed yourself...
Wait a minute, speak for yourself.
Well, I speak for myself.
That is not
here.
an assumption that I make.
But here you are.
I'm assuming they don't have their stuff together, which is why they're therapists. That's the jump I make.
But here you are being human and saying, hey, we're all going through this stuff. And it almost... I think opened up the door for maybe the people who aren't willing to get help to then go and get some help.
I think it did. I was hopeful that would be the case. It took a lot I almost didn't share the backstory. It took a lot of really thinking about it before I decided to, because I didn't want to ruin my career as a therapist. But on the other hand, I thought maybe that will be helpful to people too, is to know that we're all human. We all experience the same emotions, maybe about different things, but we all have struggles and life throws us all curveballs. It wasn't like my situation was particularly unique.
Were you surprised at how novel the concept of mental fitness was? to people?
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it, when you think about it? It's almost like, so like the gym? Yeah, very much like the gym or yoga or Pilates or whatever it is that you, or running, right? Or if you're a cyclist or any of the disciplines, physical disciplines, that there's a real parallel, but most people don't think of it that way.
No, I think historically we've thought of it more like a hospital, right? Like when you're ill, you need help and we try to make you get better, but we didn't really think about the preventative stuff. It's like you go to the gym and it helps keep your body healthy so that you don't have to go to the hospital as much, hopefully. But when it came to mental health, we didn't do the same thing. We didn't really talk about, well, what do you do on a daily basis? I think we do now. I think the door's really opened where people are now realizing. And I think if anything,
Thank you.
well, and I think if anything good came out of the pandemic, a lot of people were like, oh, yeah, I'm only a few things, away from also struggling with my
Losing my
mental health.
mind.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you're basically, the pandemic hit and everybody was walking around with a full-length mirror all the time looking at themselves.
Right.
So, I'm curious, you have now, this is your sixth book you're coming up on. What have working on these books as a writer, as a creator, taught you in terms of like analyzing yourself? Have you learned things about you along the way in helping other people?
Oh, definitely. Lots of stuff. And so I guess back to the sailboat thing, it was between book 1 and 2 that I was like, well, if I'm going to be an author, I don't have to live in rural Maine where it's cold all the time if I don't want to. Let's move on to a sailboat.
Boy,
So
boy, did you go the other direction.
right?
Maine to the Keys.
In lots of ways, it's opened up opportunities to live a completely different life. I used to be terrified of public speaking, and I gave a TEDx talk that has 23 million views, and I get paid to speak now, or I have a podcast. And so it's opened up opportunities that I would have never had. And so that's helped me grow, but also, and sitting down and writing and reflecting on things like, I believe X, Y, or Z, but is that true necessarily? It's caused me to question a lot of things that I probably held true for a long time about myself, but also about the world and other people in general too.
Just in reading the latest book, I do get the sense that you are somebody who believes what you write. There's a lot of people in this area, the self-help, that I read it and I'm just like, well, this just feels like we're trying to sell some books here. But I genuinely feel like you are walking the walk and talking the talk about what you're sharing with people.
Thank you, because that's a huge compliment, because I think self-help does have that reputation sometimes of people saying the right buzzwords and those sorts of things in an effort to sell books.
What about healthy relationships? This is my own fantasy world I'm living in right now. But I'm assuming that here you're writing these books and somebody said to you, well, what about a book about couples? What about a book about relationships? What can you write about that? And your experience, which you talk about a little bit in the book, is, I don't know, my first experience, I don't like couples therapy. I don't know if I like doing couples therapy. And now you've written a book in essence about how to have healthy relationships. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution?
Yeah, so all of my other books, they sort of came about because readers would ask me. The first book was about people, but then I had a lot of parents say, how do I raise mentally strong kids? So I wrote a parenting book, and then a women's book, and a kid's book, and a workbook. And all of those other books were about individuals, like how do I build mental strength as an individual? But obviously our relationships affect us so much. If you're in an unhealthy relationship, it doesn't matter how much you work on building mental strength, you're only going to get so far. And I didn't like seeing couples. And I tell that story because I just wanted it to be clear, like in rural Maine, you don't get the option of specializing. Like if I were a therapist in New York City, I might say, I like to see 14-year-old girls with OCD. Well, it's not really an option in Maine. You're going to see my sister or you're going to see me. You're stuck with one of us. And so I saw lots of different people. And I remember with couples, I used to feel like a referee, like I was supposed to pick sides. And until I got a little bit better at it or to figure out why are these people really coming in? And it was that a lot of people really came in because they were just looking for permission to get divorced. They weren't really there to work on themselves. But I thought, we don't have a lot of guidebooks about relationships and how to work on them. And what do you do when your partner doesn't want to work on it? How can you still do it? So I wanted to write a book that really focused on that too. Like, how do I change my relationship if my partner doesn't have the same motivation?
Well, and it's one of those things, Amy, where if we start a new job, there's training, but nobody gives us relationship training. We don't know what we're doing when we get into a
Right.
relationship.
Oh, by the way, that also goes for parenting as well. two of the most important things in life, parenting and and relationships, and there's no real guidebook.
But the book to my printer behind me is like 1,000 pages long that I'll never read, by the way. But what do you think the biggest misconception people have about when they go into a relationship thinking that this is going to be all hunky dory, we're going to ride off into the romantic sunset together, it's just going to be the way it is?
I think a lot of people base that on their initial chemistry with somebody, and they don't really take time to figure out if they're compatible over the long term, right? Like this is feel good.
You're taking the romance out of it, Aim.
I know, right? And like it feels good in the early stages. And
but I got a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because here's the thing, right? If you do have chemistry with somebody, right, and you've given it more than 4 minutes to decide that they're the one, I'm saying, you've seen them a few times and it's working. Isn't that a better way in than checking at the boxes and looking at them online and seeing and asking them what their values are?
Oh,
I mean, I understand these things as you progress become more and more important and prevalent in a relationship, but how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, I think it starts with that chemistry. And knowing that that's not the end, though, that if you and your partner have vastly different values later on, you're going to run into some trouble if you don't talk about that or figure out how you're going to manage that. And I see a lot of people that like start planning the wedding, but they don't really plan their relationship later on. Like they don't have those conversations. Or if you want kids and somebody else doesn't, like how are you going to manage that? Split the difference? Probably not, because then neither of you is happy. So you have to decide, how are we going to work on these things? And so I think that chemistry is important as a first step.
But isn't that unsexy? How are we going to work on our relationship?
Right?
Which therapist are we going to go see so that we can talk about our feelings? And I know as a dude, you just talk, I mean, mostly, obviously there's individuals and I think men are more apt to speak about their feelings these days than they ever were before. But still, dudes like, I don't want to talk. Can she just be happy?
Well, and I think sometimes people
can she just be
people
happy?
think they have to sit down and have a conversation like in 20 years when we disagree, what's going to happen? But I don't think you do. Instead, I think you figure out, like, you look at this person right now, like, how do they handle problems in their life? Can you live with the way that they handle them? Or they're impulsive with their spending. Can you live with that? And to have conversations in the moment, because the way we would say, no, like when I have a problem, I don't get mad. Well, that's our perception of ourselves. Doesn't mean it's true. So often people say on a dating app when they're putting in their profile, like you put the version that you wish you were, not really the real version of yourself. And that's why people...
It really should say control freak and wanting to fix somebody to avoid myself.
Right. Those sorts of things. Yes.
Apply here. Right? Don't you think, like, obviously you've seen couples now, you're well versed, you've gotten over your disdain for it, and you can see where it's really helpful. You help them listen to each other. It's kind of great when you're watching them connect when they haven't been connected. What a wonderful thing, right? Especially since you're a part of that. But I guess my question is, what is the number one thing that you've noticed takes couples from there's a wall to the wall starts to crumble?
I would say the desire to be committed. When you have two people that are like, all right, we have a problem, but we're willing to work through it. I mean, you could work through a lot of problems. What happens is when people are like, I got one foot out the door, or I'm not 100% committed to the relationship in general, that's when people are like, well, I'm not going to work on it because you might not stick around.
On that note, don't you think, I guess, not don't you think, I'm going to ask you specifically, how do you feel about the way social media and dating apps affect commitment?
Because there are so many choices now, it's tougher for people to stay committed, right? When you look at all of these attractive options and you think, well, look at this person, look at that person. I think that really affects people's level of commitment because they think the grass would be greener or that they could have a better life if they went with somebody else.
Same thing with jobs now, too. I mean, there's just, it's easy to switch jobs, even though the market dictates if people are going to do that or not. But when you can just jump online and see jobs all over the world, as opposed to your local newspaper that has 3 or 4 listings,
right,
you're thinking, well, I'm not going to stay in this job if I don't want to.
Can you talk about a little bit, like when people say, relationships are hard. Can you talk about exactly what that means in your experience?
So for a lot of people, it's the skills in a relationship that are tough, right? Communicating, managing your emotions, compromising, dealing with conflict, taking somebody else's...
I'm getting high.
I know, right? So you think all of those things are hard. Absolutely. But when you have somebody to go through life with, like, it also makes parts of life a lot easier too.
And I think people realize that. Some realize that also going back to COVID, because here you were not trapped in the house alone if you were with that person that you were committed to and willing to be committed to. I mean, thank God, I've been married for many years, and thank God my wife and I could do that together, because I think we would have
Because
lost our
she's a
minds.
saint.
She is a saint.
Let's not
And
mince
I'm not a
words here.
saint. Like, I'm just
I
a
mean, she's
difficult.
literally, she should be sainted.
Yes. But I will say this, Amy, like for me, going back to the idea of um like expectations in relationships and stuff like that, I feel like I was kind of broken by 80s romance movies and like the idea of
Mhm.
grandeur. And I wonder if that version is like is the social media of today, because I pictured every relationship I ever had to be these big moments of wonderful romantic gestures, but that's not life. And now here we are with social media sort of giving everybody a different kind of spotlight in a way that says, hey, I'm squeaky clean, there's nothing wrong with me. Oh, oops, there's a whole lot wrong with me.
I know, and how often have you ever seen people, like, on social media brag about their partner, and then you find out, like, they're getting divorced 2 weeks later?
Yes.
But we
Hmm.
sometimes look at those things and think, "Well, you didn't buy me roses," or, "How come I don't have that same relationship with my partner?" So it does make us compare ourselves, I think, more to other people, and it's often not even the real version that we're seeing.
It's in your book, which is great, but can you just give us a little bit, for our listeners, a little of the 101 of how you take care of yourself in a relationship while also considering your partner's needs, which is hard. I know it's a big question, but
It
it's such a
is.
huge part of how one of these tools that allows you to enjoy the relationship more.
Yeah, there's the Jerry Maguire notion of "you complete me," right? So 2 people get together and they assume, like, "I'm not gonna have any problems in life because 'cause you're gonna fix a lot of things that I need." But it doesn't really
Well, they
work like
do at the
that.
beginning. I mean, it kinda does,
Right.
you're just basically dehydrated and blissful.
Right,
It's
right.
friggin' great, for a while, and then eventually it wears off.
It does, and that's okay, but to recognize, like, "Okay, what are my needs?" Most people don't even know what their needs are, and then how do I communicate those needs? How do I ask for what I need? And it's scary to do that. Like, if you say to your partner, "Hey, I really need some help over
But
here,"
don't you
just
find most people go, "This is what I," they don't even know what they haven't even asked themselves whether this is a fair need from this person, and is this something I can give myself, and why am I having these expectations on this other person? Don't you find that being a
It
thing?
is, and sometimes people expect their partner to be their business partner, their financial partner, their person that runs the household, and you expect everything from your partner, and you're like, "That's way too much." Maybe you need some friends, maybe you need family members who can help with a lot of these needs, maybe you need time by yourself, maybe you need to work on some of these by yourself. So take some soul searching to figure out, like, "Why am I frustrated? Or why do I not feel the best right now? Oh, maybe I need something."
Do you find that people are also chasing that rush of, like, you were just talking about the idea of the early part of the relationship where you're on that high and you want that experience? So maybe somebody isn't as willing to commit to the long-term relationship because they're chasing that high of puppy dog love.
Yeah, once you're paying bills and raising kids with somebody, that, like, spark isn't gonna be there every day when they walk in the door. I think that's why a lot of people get into affairs. They're just looking for that fun and excitement again, and thinking that, often falsely thinking, "Well, this person gives it to me and it would last forever."
Well, I feel like your book is really helpful to people. I guess the major this is the way I read it, is that it's really, really helpful to people that are, like, really considering commitment and wanting to figure out whether, okay, there's so much good here. Is this something that I can have for the long haul? It's so helpful in that sense. So can you talk about a little bit about how that gets revealed in terms of couples, whether this is compatible, whether there is, like, how, and they're in that period, whether should we or should we not move forward?
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book about remembering why you fell in love in the first place, and I think for a lot of people, we lose sight of that, right? After 10 years together and you've been, struggling with finances and arguing about the kids, you kinda lose sight of, "Why did I pick this person in the first place?"
Or even, like, I noticed that, just my own observations, there's a lot of people within that 3 to 8 year, they're living together, they have the dog,
Dog's always the first step.
their finances are sometimes together, right? And then they're like, are we going? Is this? Are we going to buy a place together? Are we going to move somewhere together? Am I going to follow you for your job? That next level of commitment.
And that's just it. There are often those milestones of like, all right, this is getting serious now, or this is getting extra serious, or there's no going back. Once we buy this place together, then it's going to be really hard to separate ourselves. So for a lot of people, it happens like that in increments before they're ready to take the full plunge and say, all right, let's be completely committed.
So, Amy, my favorite chapter was Lucky 13, Healthy Couples Don't Stop Growing and Changing. And I am guilty of this too, because I'll say something silly or, I'm the quirky one in my household relationship. And so I'll say something else. Let's tell my wife, you used to laugh at that when we first got together, only to, forget that, she was fresh out of college. We didn't have kids. Some of my jokes were silly for a different period back then, but that we have to accept that we're not going to be the same person. I'm not the same person. She's not the same person. Can you talk to that a little bit about how nobody stays the same, and it probably wouldn't be healthy if we did?
Yeah, and I think that often sometimes people think, well, we're growing apart. Well, you can both grow as individuals and not necessarily grow apart. And that you can appreciate what's changed about your partner. Well, they might not laugh at the same kinds of jokes that they did 20 years ago. I bet there's some pretty awesome things that they now do or have about them that they didn't have 20 years ago. And just remember keeping all of that in perspective, and that, yeah, and we've changed as people and our lives have changed. You've gone through a lot and how long you've been together, but at the same time, there's some beauty in that, in figuring out. I mean, how boring would it be if you and your partner never changed, right? After 20 years, you'd absolutely know everything about them. But hopefully you keep surprising one another. You keep challenging yourself, and your partner's like, really? I never knew that about you.
And the real fun part is that now my daughter, who's 7 years old, laughs at my immature jokes. So it's
See?
really, balances out.
You still have an audience somewhere.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about the self-analyzing tool? Because obviously that's a huge part of it. You sort of have to have a sense of yourself and what you're bringing into the relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, obviously our perceptions of ourselves are often very different, right? You might think, I don't talk too much. And your partner's all, oh, yeah. In my opinion, you do. Or,
oh, the list of things that I didn't know that I did that were annoying is immense. I can't believe it. I literally started writing down, okay, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. So, by the way, they weren't that annoying at the beginning. Now I've just become the most annoying human being on the planet.
I know during COVID, some people were like, they saw their partner at work for the first time. They'd never seen them sit behind a computer and work. And people would be like, I didn't know I was married to like the loud typer in the office.
I did have that experience. My wife has like a different way of talking to coworkers and stuff. And I was like, who is this person?
Yeah.
Why does it sound so
that
different?
Tone. I haven't heard that tone. That's a nice, kind tone. I love that tone.
I talked to somebody who said that. She said, my husband's like, gets on the phone with his coworkers and he becomes like a surfer dude. He's like, yo, man. And she's like, he doesn't talk like that. I have no idea why he does that.
But I was asking about the self-analyzing thing. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So I
interrupted to talk about me. It happened. Sorry.
I think it's helpful sometimes to get feedback from our partners and be like, how do you see me? Or do I come across too strong? Am I sometimes a jerk when we do this? And to take that as just feedback, their opinion, it gives us more insight into who we are. Because it's not just about who I think I am, but it makes a difference who my partner sees me as, right?
Okay, so basically they have to go through your books. Now, I can see somebody reading your first book being able to ask those questions, because at the point where they get the response, they're able to accept it and work through it and decide whether it's true for them or not true for them. The layman, the normal person, usually will take what their partner says so personally.
Right.
It's devastating. I'll tell you something. I play a piece of music for my wife, and if she doesn't like it, I'm wrecked. I play it for a friend, and they're like, it's not great. I'm like, whatever. I'll do another one.
Yeah.
So there's something about, very much like, a parent, where disapproval from a parent is devastating.
But there's also that's putting pressure on that spouse to say, hey, your opinion matters so much to me. Don't give me honest criticism.
But people don't do that. They don't say that. They don't
No.
go, hey, by the way, I'm really sensitive. That'd be great. Hey, by the way, I value your opinion, but just be gentle, because I'm very sensitive about this. They don't do that. They just go, hey, what do you think? And when the person is like, chopping vegetables, and they're like, yeah, it's fine.
And maybe there's a difference too of asking your partner to critique like your artwork. So whether you're married to a chef or you're married to a musician, like that's an opinion of something you've created, which I think is different than an opinion of maybe how you behaved in a social situation. So if my husband gives me feedback with like, Amy, you came out a little strong in that moment, or you could have said this differently. Like, I'll certainly sit back and evaluate that, and think, did I, or how could I have done that differently? Versus if he said to me like, gee, I read your books and they're terrible. Like, it's not, that would come across like, okay, that's my artwork I'm putting out there into the world. So that would certainly feel different than if he just gave me some advice on something I could change.
Well, like one of the things that I've noticed is I've spread out my feedback for different subjects of my life through a bunch of people, but there's always one or two that is particular to my wife because she's just great at it. Money and work. She's just fantastic. She has a real even keel, and she's, I call her bottom line because she just gives you the bottom line. This is what it is, which I love. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about, what is appropriate to go to your partner with and what is not appropriate to go to your partner with? Where do you need to, speaking of, having somebody be your everything, and what's the balance? What do you tell people? How do you balance that out where you don't go to your partner for everything, but you go to them for things so you can continue to connect?
Yeah, I think just taking into consideration what are their strengths, like what do they have knowledge and skills in? If you're an entrepreneur and your partner isn't, you may not go to them for business advice, right? You might have somebody else, and you might not burden them with a lot of the business day-to-day stuff because it's not their thing and they're not going to be able to really weigh in on it. Versus, yeah, if they manage a lot of the money and they do a good job, go to them for that. And to just, I think it's an experiment. Sometimes you ask somebody a question, you go to your grandmother for business advice and she tells you something that's not helpful. Like, oh, okay, thank you very much for that. You don't have to like take it into consideration, and then you might just move on and be like, I'm going to ask somebody else next time.
All right, I got the ultimate question for people that struggle with other people having feelings. Okay, so your partner starts going into, and this and that and the work, and this is a problem, and I'm having that. What is the appropriate response while allowing them to vent or have their feelings?
Ooh, good question.
Oh, I know. There's a lot of people that are very happy with me right now with this question because it's true. Because people need to vent, and who are you letting your hair down more with than your partner? But yet sometimes as somebody who cares and is worried or concerned, you either want to fix it or you want to solve it or you want them to shut the fuck up because they do this all the time.
Right.
What is the appropriate response?
So I think it's helpful to ask somebody, like, what is it that you're looking for? So if you come home from work every day and complain about your job, like, what is it that you would like me to do? You're looking for advice? Because sometimes somebody comes home and they're like, oh, my boss did this, this, and this. And the other person's like, well, you march into the boss's office tomorrow and give him a piece of your mind, and here's what to say. And the person's like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, well, then why are you telling me this if you don't want to take my advice? But if you have a conversation of like, what is it that you need from this? Are you looking to solve a problem? You just want to tell me how you feel about the problem?
So it's basically, babe, how can I help?
Yes. To sum it up.
Okay.
Yep.
I have a really specific question, Amy. Okay. Relationship question.
This isn't a podcast. This is free therapy.
I want a fourth dog. I want a fourth dog. And I know my wife's going to listen to this. And she doesn't really, it's not a big fan of dogs. But right now we have a small, a medium, and a large dog. And I want an extra large dog. Should I bring that dog into the house, Amy?
I would say definitely not surprise her. Like, oh, look what I found, right? Okay. Or he's a stray.
Look at what you got for the holidays.
I saved him.
Merry Christmas.
I found this beautiful St. Bernard in the garbage can.
Right.
And he's coming home with us.
So I would not suggest those strategies. However, but I guess, do you know why she doesn't want a dog? Like, is it the dog fur, the maintenance? It costs too much?
Chaos. It's the chaos of it all. Yeah.
And that's tough to argue with that one too, right? And especially when you're like, I'm going to bring home a
So you're siding with her. I understand. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just.
Give us the listener question, Danny.
Oh yeah, the listener question. Sorry, I just get consumed with me. Our listener question is from Rocco D. Can your book be used for other types of relationships like friendships, coworkers, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, absolutely. Originally I was going to make a more generic book, like about relationships in general. But then I decided to make it, let's make it about the most important relationship in your life. But certainly the communication skills, a lot of the strategies in there can work for relationship with your mother, your siblings, your boss, as well.
Number one communication skill. Number one. Gotta have it.
Uh,
Can't do without.
I would say listening. And listening doesn't just mean staying quiet, but it's like trying to understand what the person says before you jump in and say what your response is.
Oh, she's so sweet, isn't she? And smart.
Mm-hmm.
I like sweet, smart, attractive people. who, by the way, who commit their life to helping others. I mean, she's just a winner all the way across.
Now imagine her in rural Maine helping like loggers and fishermen.
Is that amazing?
Awesome.
Like her and her sister. Like, who's your therapist? Well, her last name's Morin. That's all.
One of the Morin sisters.
One of the Morin sisters. Like, they're famous around town. Like, basically, either one of them can't go anywhere without hey, Morin. Hey, Amy.
Tell me her life story isn't a hour, dramatic series, 10
it's
p.m.
a
slot.
sitcom. Okay, wait a minute. It's a sitcom.
I think the one with her and her
Maine.
sister are, but then she
It
moves
is.
on the boat, and I'm seeing like, you meet all these wacky characters in the Keys. This is this could be like an hour, like almost like Northern Exposure, but Southern Exposure.
That's what. Yeah, Southern. The Keys to Life.
Mm-hmm.
Which would be fun. She's great. I hope people get the book. It really is. It reads very simple. I mean, it's not complicated. It doesn't feel like mental gymnastics. Yeah, digestible and also practical.
Mm-hmm.
And I like what she basically says. She basically says in her book, it's cool when we talk about sex. That's right, sex, which is, by the way, we didn't talk about, which I wanted to talk about because the whole chapter in that book is we don't talk about sex.
And then we didn't.
But it was great that she interviewed, someone who's, a top person in that field in terms of sex therapy, which was cool. And that interview is excellent. And I'm stumbling over my word, sex.
But I will say this: she did agree with me that I should get a fourth dog.
It's
and
not.
It's
So funny because not what I heard.
That's not what happened.
And if this wasn't recorded, I'd be concerned. But since it is,
all of a sudden her answer will be me going, "Yes, you should get a fourth dog."
What happened to Amy's voice? All right. Well, this was fun, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Music by Denny Nucci. Produced and edited by the same two people you heard hosting this show because they have no friends.